the key here is that this is one of our most important battle honours. It was celebrated back in 2015 at Cardiff, where the regimental home headquarters is. And this is a photograph showing the participants in this, officers and NCOs. The KDG, for their years until they amalgamated with Queen's Base in 1959, always celebrated the Battle of Waterloo on the 18th of June, and with the exceptions of the wartime years, for example, the First and Second World Wars, this is a tradition whereby both the sergeants and the officers celebrate this dinner. The sergeants entertain the officers. Normally ends up with some quite fun and games and mess rugby, as many of us will know. But the tradition, as the QDGs will pretty much know, is that at the end of the battle, there were only 13 or 15. The eyewitness, Regimental Sergeant Major Barlow, gives two numbers, 13 and 15. This first account, he talks about 2 officers, himself the RSM, 1 sergeant and 9 men. These were the only men standing out of sort of 540 odd men who charged on the day. And these were the only people who were still standing, and they had a meal together. If you know the battlefield of Waterloo, there's a memorial to the French Garde Impériale, which is the monument of the fallen eagle, and that is where they actually celebrated this meal at the end of the battle. Why did I want to write this book? Well, this painting is really the reason I wanted to write this book. It's the famous Lady Butler painting, 1881. It's at Leeds Art Gallery. It's wrong for a lot of reasons. The Greys, when they went to fight, they were walking, not charging. They went uphill, not downhill. They didn't carry their guidon. They had canvas covers on their hats. And they're all charging to a point. If they carried on charging like this, they all ended up on top of each other. But anyway, it's a fantastic picture, and it's done no end of good for the PR for the Greys and now the Scots Dragoon Guards. And this has led to a lot of sort of discussion about the role of cavalry at Waterloo. And the feeling is that the Greys seem to be the only regiment that seem to get any kind of credits for this battle. Now, the KDGs were by far the biggest regiment. They were twice as big as the other household troops, and a good sort of 2/3 the size of the regiments in the Union Brigade. So I just thought that there's been a very good book written by Bishop Michael Mann called And They Rode On, which is an excellent book about the KDGs at Waterloo. But I really wanted to dig a bit deeper than Reverend Mann's excellent book and go into a bit more detail about the men. And the book really just digs into the officers and men, their backgrounds and what happened to them afterwards. And also I've spent a lot of time looking at the French perspective and French sources to try and piece together, because although having read And They Rode On gave a very good idea of the KDGs at the battle, it didn't go into enough detail for me, and I wanted to really dig down to try and find out what really happened. And I think I've pieced together a bit more. We'll never know the full answers to what happened to certain, like the right-hand squadron, but it certainly gives a bit more idea about the officers and men and what actually happened on the day. So really, again, the QDGs will know this picture, which was commissioned, painted by Peter Archer, excellent artist who used to, I think, illustrate the Hardy Boys books I remember as a kid, and it hangs in the officers' mess of the QDGs. Here you can see Captain Turner's 8th Troop and Captain Nola's 6th Troop routing Ordners 1st Cuirassier. You can see the one on the sabre, on the sort of the blanket, and they're coming into also contact with Quillot's infantry, and that's to the east of La Haye Saint. So you're looking basically with the main road runs north-south, and they're riding down the eastern side. That's where the majority of the King's Dragoon Guards charged. One squadron charged to the west with the 1st Life Guards, which is the other side of the building. In terms of the background to the regiment, I just wanted to, for those who aren't conversant with the QDG's history, to start off with the history of the regiment. The regiment was founded to deal with the Duke of Monmouth's rising, when the King James II raised several regiments of Dragoon Guards. They weren't called Dragoon Guards, they were regiments of horse. And the regiment was raised as the Queen's Horse after Mary of Modena, who's the Queen's wife. They then became called the King's Horse in 1714 before being called KDGs in 1747. And you can see a picture of the capture of the drum horse at the Battle of Ramillies. When I'm digging into this battle, it's rather unfortunate because this painting hangs in the mess, but really having done the research, I think it's more likely to be the Royal Dragoons of Ireland, later the 5th Lancers, that actually captured these drums. But anyway, let's not spoil a good story. It's a great picture by Robert Alexander Hillingford. The regiment took part in the 9 Years' War. As I said, one of the first major actions on the continent was the Battle of Neerlanden or Landen, which the British, Dutch and the Bavarians took on the French. It was a French victory, sadly. Then the Wars of Spanish Succession, the famous wars of John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, in conjunction with Austrians and Prussians and the Dutch, Danes, Hesse-Kassel and Homburg versus the French and the Bavarians, and later the Spanish. These were the battles of Blenheim, Ramillies, Oudenarde, Malplaquet. So they really were, the King's Dragoon Guards were in the thick of the action in the early 18th century. As the century continued, they were involved in the Wars of the Austrian Succession, Battle of Dettingen, which was a very bloody affair, 1743, Allied win, which was the British, the Hanoverians and Austrians versus the French. In the 7 Years' War, the Battle of Warburg, 1760, which is illustrated here. You can see in the left of the picture a chap on a black frock coat, bareheaded. That's John Manners, Marquis of Granby, who was leading the charge, who lost his hat, and it's where the expression apparently going bald-headed at the enemy comes from. This 7 Years' War was followed by the French Revolutionary War, the Battle of Beaumont, 1794, which was Anglo-Austrians against the French. This was the last action fought by the KDGs, and it's some 21 years before the Battle of Waterloo. So it's quite significant that none of these men, when they turned up on the battlefield, had any battlefield experience. A couple of the officers had been present in the Peninsula, Battersby for one, as I seem to remember, but the soldiers had no real experience of fighting. The commanding officer, Colonel Fuller, took over in 1805. He had been, I think, in the 11th Light Dragoons off the top of my head. The regiment had been going through a bad time. They had a crooked commanding officer who was very bad on discipline, and Fuller basically gripped the regiment and turned it around between 1805 and 15. The regiment, just before the Battle of Waterloo, was posted in Ireland and ended up in Clonmel in 1812. In terms of uniforms and weapons, here's just some illustrations of KDGs of the time. You can see the first two pictures on the left-hand side are contemporary, and some more modern pictures on the right. Basically, the grey trousers and the boots and the white gloves are for on active service abroad, and the white breeches and long boots and long gauntlets are for home service. It's interesting to look, part of my book was to look into the backgrounds. Clive Morris did some great work in pulling together all the records of all the soldiers who fought at Waterloo, and I was able to take that information and put it into spreadsheets and get an idea of where they came from. And like all these things, that often it's a product of the economy, and where parts of the country were doing badly economically is where the greatest recruits came from in the 5 to 10 years before Waterloo. 16% of the regiment were from Leicestershire, 12% from Lancashire, and 10% from Hampshire. Those are the biggest three regiments. Leicester, the reason was because of the Napoleonic Wars. There was a fall in fashion for knitted hosiery. The stocking knitting trade or industry of Leicester was broken, and therefore there were a lot of men who had experience with horses but who hadn't got a job join the regiment. Lancashire, there'd been a problem in terms of coal pricing, so a lot of miners, you'd think would be small men, but they weren't, joined the regiment. And then Hampshire's an interesting one, and I can't quite work out why this agricultural county produced so many soldiers. In fact, it sort of resonates with me because many of them came from near where I lived. I mean, 6 came from the village of Kingsclere, which is sort of the nearest village close to Ollie as well. 21 from a 15-mile radius and 43 from a 20-mile radius. And I think partly the reason is that one of the sergeant majors, David Benwell, he grew up, funnily enough, just down the road from me. He worked on his uncle's farm, which is still standing. An ex Irish Guard officer lives there now, just opposite Cheam School, Longcross Farm. And in the house that I'm sitting in now, two of the KDGs, Joseph Long, who's a KDG who died at Waterloo, two of his brothers was born in the farmhouse just here. So it's right on my doorstep. Just moving on in terms of the type of people, I mean, as I said, there were a lot of these had been agricultural labourers or working in industry. They were paid a lot more in the army. I did some work on that, and obviously the pay was attractive, and that's what attracted them. There were big men. I think many people know that were big men on big horses. They actually got smaller. 1798, the average size has been 5'10". They went down to 5'7". But don't forget, the average person in Britain was a lot smaller. The average size of a soldier in the British Army at the time of Waterloo was 5'4". So they were big men. Here's just a couple of illustrations showing an officer on the left with white breeches, gauntlets, and large boots. He's on home service. On the right is a private with grey breeches, riding gloves, and riding boots. He's on active service abroad. He's carrying the in 1796 heavy cavalry carbine, and they were also equipped with the Knox 1796 pattern heavy dragoon pistol. So the main weapon was the 1796 Troopers Heavy Cavalry sword with a hatchet point. This was 35 inches long and 1.5 inches wide. The officers had a honeysuckle guard. It was handmade, whereas the soldiers, you can see, it's one of the first versions of mass-produced Industrial Revolution armaments. A game changer was on the 6th of May 1815 in the Regimental, KDG's Regimental diary. I spied that there was an entry that Lieutenant General Lord Uxbridge, later Anglesey, made, the quotation said he instructed for the broadswords to be ground at the point. And this is really significant. There'd been a big debate in the army whether to use the blade or the point. The French were advocates of using the point. One of the British Army instructors had talked about the use of the blade. I think his name was Le Marchand, who I think had been at Queen's Bay. And there was a big debate on which was the best method to use. But as their main adversaries in terms of cavalry were to be cuirassiers, it was pretty pointless trying to slash at people with armour on. So the point was essential, and that made a big difference to the day. It would have been pretty awful had they not had points on their weapons. On the right, you can see the 1812 Type 2 pattern dragoon helmet. This was worn, this distinguished the KDGs amongst the rest of the household troops. The lifeguards and blues wore the Minerva pattern helmet, but over on the east, the Union Brigade were wearing the same helmet, the Royal Dragoons and the Enniskillens. Obviously the Scots Greys had their busbies covered with a canvas cover. In terms of command, as many will know, Lieutenant General Lord Uxbridge, later the 7th Marquess Anglesey, was in command. I'm sorry for the fuzzy slide, but he's in the uniform of the 7th Light Dragoons, and a lot of his ADCs were from the 7th Light Dragoons. He'd been chosen over Combermere. Waterloo hadn't been too keen to hire him, as he was, well, he had been having, he actually married Wellington's younger brother, Henry's wife. He was having an adulterous affair with her. So Wellington didn't really want him to be his general, but in the end, he took him with good grace. In terms of the two heavy cavalry brigades, the Household Brigade was commanded by Major General Lord Edward Somerset, as many probably know, from the Plantagenet family. And the Union Brigade was Major General Sir William Ponsonby, who died in the battle. In terms of regimental organisation, this slide, I'm afraid I cut Fuller's head off, but the regiment was, I mean, this is a matter for huge debate, and we can spend a lot of time on it, but there were 592 KDGs present at Waterloo, 27 regimental officers, 1 surgeon, 82 NCOs, 482 men, and I believe around about 539, 540 charged. So present were 606 ranks. If you deduct deductions for sickness, you had 592 men, 27 officers, and 565 other ranks. There had been some double counting of trumpeters. So around about 540 in the first charge. We don't know how many were in the rear party, but this equates to 4 squadrons of 134 men, comprising 8 troops of 67 men. So you can see squadrons, 4 men of 134 men, 536, and likewise 8 troops of approximately 67 men. So the troops were commanded by lieutenants or captains, and the squadrons by the senior captains of the regiment. In terms of the commanding officer was William Fuller. He came from a merchant banking family. They lived in Surrey, and I believe that his nephew actually joined the regiment afterwards, but not much is known after him. He died at Waterloo, as many would know. He was originally in the 10th Dragoons, not the 11th Light Dragoons, and he transferred, as I said, in 1805 to command the regiment. On the right is Henry Graham, not much known about him. He was an old Harrovian. I think his father had been the chaplain there. He was killed at Waterloo by Lancers, and he commanded the right-hand squadron. He was called the major of the regiment, so in other words, the second in command. The KDGs will all be familiar with the painting on the left, which is John Brinkhurst, who went to Oundle, I believe, and he had been married. He also had gone to Cambridge, I think, and was in a university educated officer. He commanded 5th Troop, and his troop suffered the greatest casualties and went the furthest on the right-hand side of in the west. Now, on the right is a great picture. It's a great picture because I don't think many QDGs will have seen this before, and I managed to track down this painting. This was the youngest officer at Waterloo, and he was killed. He was the Honourable Henry Ball Bernard. He was taken prisoner, and I think a lot of the KDG prisoners were murdered by the French. There were sort of not eyewitness accounts, but many accounts mentioned this. I tracked this down because I managed to trace down the family of the Bernard family to Castle Bernard in Southern Ireland. And I managed to track down off the internet after a planning permission. I found Lady Frances Carter's sister, who she gave me her sister's email address in Ireland. And they still live in the same house that young Henry grew up in. They actually got burnt out by the IRA, but they now live in the coach house, I believe, in the garden. And she produced this picture, which is fantastic. You know, none of us had seen this before. And he's not in the uniform of the KDGs. He's in according to an authority, Andrew Cormack, he's in a yeomanry uniform, probably some Cork or some sort of Irish yeomanry regiment. But he died there. It's quite an interesting fact that several of the officers still live in the same houses. Not only did it.
But if you willing,
can you hear me? Good. Sorry. As well as the Bernards, we also have the Quicks still live in Newton St Sars in Devon. There were 2 Quicks who charged at Waterloo. The Brooks still live at Colebrook in County Fermanagh, and the Eltons still live in Clifton Court. So it's quite interesting how there's still continuity. A couple more portraits. On the left is Robert Tooby Hawley, who was wounded at Waterloo, left on half pay in 1819. His descendant, the Reverend Anthony Hawley, was in touch, and he came along to the book launch. And on the right is James Leatham, who's a lieutenant at Waterloo, who retired on half pay in 1825. The regiment has his portrait and medal, and I believe possibly his helmet, but I'm not sure on that one. Not much is known about Leatham. He married a lady from Ireland and moved over to Ireland after he left the regiment in 1825. Of the other ranks, on the left is James Reed, who lives in Ollie Larmany's village. He basically was busted several times, rose up through the ranks to sergeant and was discharged in 1839. He lived in Wootton St Lawrence. And one of my favourite images is on the right. I mean, there's something quite special about seeing a photograph of someone who charged at Waterloo. And even more special that his great-great-grandson came to my book signing. On the right is John Derry, who was a private at Waterloo, discharged in 1821. And Peter, his great-great-grandson, came to the book signing along with William Elton's not descendant but relation, the Honourable Julia Elton, and Henry Bernard and Robert Hawley, who are related to the other aforementioned officers. So that's a little bit about the KDGs who participated, the command structure, who they were, what equipment they had. Moving on to their main opponents in terms of the French cavalry. And this is really, I think, quite interesting. Is we've got two slides here. On the left, we have a first cuirassier, and on the right, fourth cuirassier. These were the two regiments that the KDGs faced, and they broke in the first charge at Waterloo. The first cuirassiers were known as les Gros Fers, the big brothers. They basically were founded as a regiment of fer in 1635 in the days of the great Marshal Turenne. They had red facings. These guys were seriously experienced. They'd been in action almost continuously for the previous 10 years. They won battle honours at Austerlitz in 1805. They'd been at Jena in 1806, Eylau 1807, Wagram 1809, Moscow 1812, Leipzig 1813. So extremely experienced. They were commanded by a chap called Ordonez, who was a very experienced cavalry officer and very highly rated. The fourth cuirassiers were known as la Reine Mère. They were founded a little bit later in 1643, and they were shown by their aurore or orange facings, and obviously they got fourth written on their bedding rolls and on their sabotage. The regiment again was highly experienced. They fought in Italy in Germany 1806 to 7, Austria in 1809, Russia 1812, and Leipzig in 1830. And they just defeated the Prussian cavalry at the Battle of Ligny a couple of days before the Battle of Waterloo. So we had KDG greenhorns pitted against these very experienced French cavalry, and not only were they more experienced, but they were armored. Obviously, as the name would suggest, they had cuirasses, but they also had a longer sword, which makes a big difference in a one-on-one fight. They had a sword called the Année 13th, 13th, or 11th, and it was a fantastically beautiful sword, much nicer than the British sword. You can see on the right the British sword with a hatchet point next door to the French Année 13 or Année 11, and the French sword is a clear 3.5 inches longer than the British sword. So it's a real advantage when you're fighting one-on-one. The British did have an advantage in their horses. The quality of British horses was much higher. The French had a real problem. Napoleon had a real problem. They'd had to use police horses, and so the British were definitely better mounted on the day. In terms of the fighting, I just wanted to show this illustration here on the right-hand side of a KDG using the point to stick it through the neck of a cuirassier. They couldn't obviously slash, and they had to use the point. The French are incorrectly being shown using sabres. Obviously, they had pointed weapons. So these were the main opponents on the way out in the first charge. The KDGs, when they charged out, on the way back, they got circled by cuirassiers and lancers and attacked in the flank. And here's a picture on the left, shows the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th French lancers, line cavalry. The ones that the KDGs faced were the two guys on the right in the purple and the kind of crimson. They're the 3rd and 4th lancers of Jacquinot's 1st Cavalry Division. On the right, the red lancers of the Guard Cavalry. I puzzled and I had to put my hand up. There were two Colberts commanding different lancer regiments, and French primary sources talk about KDG, well, where the KDGs were, British cavalry, heavy cavalry being engaged by Colbert's men, and I still can't work out. I'm pretty sure it's Red Lancers, because we have someone from the 2nd Life Guards, Weymouth, talks about Red Lancers, and also one of the Scots Greys also talks about Red Lancers, in pretty much the area on the sort of easternmost of the KDG's charge. And they had similar battle experience to those of the cuirassiers, so very experienced soldiers. I don't want to go into huge detail of the battle. Many of you are familiar with the battle, but in terms of the actual action, you can see this map here. I'm afraid, again, it's probably doesn't come out terribly clearly, but you can sort of see in the north the red of the Allies and in the south the blue of the French. The Allied line stretching from Braine-l'Alleud over in the west across to Chemin-d'Ohain in the east. And this was the scene, this is the dispositions of the forces around about 11:15, when Napoleon started engagements on the Hougoumont farmhouse. So at 11:30 a.m., the bombardment and assault began on Hougoumont by the 6th Division of Rey's Corps under Prince Jerome. This was meant to be, many historians believe, a feint by Napoleon, because his main strike was going to come in the east from Derland's Call, which I don't know if you can see my mouse, but there's Derland's Call there, and obviously Huguemont is this area here. The KDG are depicted by this picture of the KDG horse here, and you can see this is Somerset. This is the Household Brigade on the west, and onto the east is Ponsonby's Union Brigade, ready for their famous charge. At around 1 to 1:30 in the afternoon, the Grand Patrie opened up, and 16,000 men of Derland's Corps advanced with the drumbeat of the pas de charge. There was nothing but a huge array of smoke. All the primary sources talk about smoke, rather ghostly. All they could see when the French appeared, they appeared out of the smoke. You can see on the extreme left, which was Couillott's division, and of that, Charlet's brigade, with the brigade that enveloped La Haye-Saint. The second brigade was Bourgeois' brigade, which also was fighting this area. Over to the east is Donzelot, Marconnet, and Durette, with the other divisions. Again, this shows the KDG's dispositions. You can see it's a bit fuzzy, but in reserve were the horse guards. In the due west was the Life Guards. In the centre were the KDGs, and on the right or in the east were the second Life Guards. There's the main road running down to La Belle Alliance, with La Haye-Saint here, and on the left or on the east are the Royals, the 1st Dragoons, then the 6th, the Inniskillens, and then on the ultimate east flank the Scots Greys. At 2 o'clock, Brigadier General Dubois' 1st Cavalry Brigade, which I mentioned, consisting of the 1st and 4th Cuirassiers, located here to the west of the main road, engaged the Lüneburg Battalion, the 1st Hanoverian Brigade, in the open. They destroyed it. They caused 50% casualties. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Klink, was wounded. And at the same moment, Charlet starts attacking La Haye-Saint. And at this crucial juncture, about 2:20, the Uxbridge, and not Wellington, Uxbridge got his timing just right. He launched the heavy cavalry, the Household and Union brigades. Again, apologies, there's too much crammed onto this picture to see any clarity, and it's rather fuzzy, but the general idea is that, again, that the illustrations, the pictures here show the KDG's movement. Here on the left, we're looking also, rather than confuse you, we're looking from the north to the south. So we've got the perspective of the KDGs when they charged. This is where the farm of Mont Saint-Jean is. The forming up areas where the Hotel 1815 is now, if anyone knows the battlefield. So in the east, we've got the Union Brigade, as I said, the Royals, their shoulders on the road, then Inniskillens, and then the Greys. To the front was the Allied infantry, and to the right in the west, we've got the 2nd Life Guards, KDGs, and the Life Guards, and in reserve, the Blues. So we see with the charges going down, again, from sort of reading as many primary sources as I could, I tried to piece together where we felt the charge was. And really, the best idea I got, it seems that actually most of the KDGs charged out of their area where they were supposed to be advancing, and they charged to the east of La Haye-Saint. So that was Turner's squadron, Naylor's squadron, and Elton's squadron all ended up to the east. The only squadron that charged the west was under Graham, with Brinkhurst and Battersby, where all the officers died, and they charged too far. They charged from this position sort of down and up to the ridge. They charged actually into the French positions, and that's where a lot of them got killed. So whereas the other, Elton basically fought along with the 1st Life Guards in the area of La Haye-Saint. His squadron was kept intact and got back to their lines in good order. Naylor and Turner ended up with the Scots Greys on the gun line, and some of their troops, for example, 4th Troop, Sweeney's troop, ended up right in amongst the French Lancers, which I think are the Red Lancers up here, but they could have been the Lancers over there, Soubrevis, which is another Colbert Lancer regiment. 2 brothers called Colbert commanded Lancer regiments. And for example, I mean, Sweeney, he sustained 17 lance wounds from the French, and Napoleon insisted that he was treated by his famous surgeon Larrey. John Sweeney's brother Mark was a Royal Naval officer. One of the anecdotes I like best about this battle is that when Napoleon finally went into exile, was taken to St. Helena after escaping from Elba, he was on board ship with on HMS Northumberland, and the duty officer was John Sweeney's brother Mark. And Napoleon, who had a great memory for faces, said, "I've seen you somewhere before." And Mark Sweeney knew that his brother John had been captured and interviewed by Napoleon, and said, "It's not me, it's my brother." So it's amazing how they looked similar, and Napoleon remembered them. Anyway, in terms of the battle, the progress, the first charge that kicked off about 2:20 past, the whole affair was probably over within an hour. And just going to show the next slide where they formed up. This is looking from the west. So if you can imagine, we're looking from the west, and we've got, so if I just flick back to the previous slide, we're looking from a position here. We're looking from here, and we're looking at the first lifeguards in the foreground. So here we are, we're looking at the first lifeguards in the foreground. The KDGs are pretty much here where the smoke is appearing. You can see the Minerva helmets of the lifeguards. And obviously you've got Somerset with his staff in the background. So the badly behaved horse is not a KDG, it's a lifeguard. So after the first charge, they moved down, as I say, and it was all over within an hour. Most of the regiment were casualties. There was not, I think it was one squadron left out of all 4 squadrons still fighting after this first charge, which lasted an hour. So basically they ran out of control. Uxbridge was in the first line. He regretted being the first line. He couldn't recall them. Both the Blues and the Enniskillens were supposed to be in reserve and bring the front lines back. Didn't. They charged in the front line. And so the result was chaos, and they basically, the heavy cavalry charged too far. Most of them tried to make their way back on the east side of the battlefield. The French carried out an encircling movement using lancers and cuirassiers, and with dreadful effect. This is where a lot of the KDG casualties, and those of the heavy cavalry, took place, limping back to the original positions. Moving on, this shows we're looking now from the eastern side. We're looking, if you look at the right of the road, where the man with the pickaxe is over here, this is a sandpit where the rifle brigade were installed. And this is where the majority of the regiment, 3 of the squadrons of the regiment, charged along with the lifeguards into this area here. To the west, you can see where Graham's squadron charged. Interestingly enough, you can see there's a burial party over here. And this is, I spoke to some archaeologists when I was at Waterloo, and apparently this is where the burial pit, the KDG burial pit, is outside the western gate. There is, I don't know the name of the charity, but certainly for soldiers who have suffered from stress or from injury, contemporary soldiers can go on these special battlefield digs, and they plan to excavate this particular burial pit, which could be very interesting from the KDG's point of view. And this is where Fuller, the commanding officer, Shelver, his adjutant, and Brinkhurst and the portrait are buried, or believed to be buried in this area here. Here's more pictures. I like this picture again because this is, Hannah mentioned that the proceeds from this book, net proceeds from this book, are going to go towards a monument, or hope to go for a monument. Patrick Andrews has done a great job. Patrick Andrews is an officer in the Queen's Dragoon Guards who's based in Brussels, and he has done a lot of work in looking at a possible spot for monuments. And both he and I agree that an ideal place to put it would be just to put pretty much where this cuirassier and KDG are fighting here, which is in a lay-by. It's on the N5 Chaussée de Charleroi, and it's just on the sort of eastern side where people can actually drive in and see the monument. And it's, you know, very pertinent. It's where the KDGs fought and died, opposite La Haye Saint. That's the eastern side of La Haye Saint. Another picture which is interesting. This shows Uxbridge waving his sabre in the right-hand side of the picture. to sound the recall at the end of the first charge. Again, it's difficult to tell whether these are KDGs or Royals. Of all the uniforms, the KDGs and Royals had almost identical uniforms apart from their cuffs, and the KDGs had a gauntlet cuff which was folded back with the blue and the gold and the red, which is reflected in the mess kit worn by the KDGs to this day. I think in all likelihood these are KDGs because of the shape of their helmet and the fact they're described as guards, whereas the Royals were dragoons. Again, the docking of tails was only done by the household troops, whereas the line cavalry didn't dock their tails. In terms of the charge, as I explained, the three KDG squadrons charged to the east, and they ended up on the gun line of the Grand Battery, along with the Greys and the Enniskillens and the Royals. And here is a picture, I think it's a 19th century picture, but it does show this mix-up. You've got a Grey here with his busby, you've got a Dragoon guard or Dragoon here. You've even got, I think, a Minerva helmet over here. Minerva helmet over here would have been one of the lifeguards. So a complete mix-up at the French guns in terms of the end of the first charge. So 2:20, the heavy cavalry of the Union and the Household Brigades charge through the French guns up to the French positions, where they're faced by infantry in square, Bachelot and Lobau's infantry squares, and this is where the KDGs suffered their most casualties. They were also counterattacked in the eastern flank. So we're looking from the south to the north. This is at the Greys charging towards the cuirassier counterattack. They're being also attacked in the eastern flank by Bro's 4th Lancers to the east. The KDG and the 2nd Life Guards to their east faced counterattacks from the 5th, the 6th, 9th and 10th cuirassiers of Delort's division. So they were pretty much encircled. French primary sources talk about this. This is a stylized representation by Joan Wanklin that hangs in the officers' mess of Wellington reviewing the remnants of the KDGs after the first charge. RSM Barlow said there were only around about 50 men out of the 536 odd or whatever who charged in the first charge. But it gives a good idea that the regiment was down to very few men after that first charge. So it was kind of battle over for the KDGs after that first hour of fighting. Yet they did fulfill a very important role in terms of defence and filling the line for the rest of the day, and made some plucky charges to try and keep the French away. But really, I've only talked about the first charge because that's really the main action that the KDGs and the Household and the Union Brigades took part in, and the most, really a significant part of stopping Napoleon from gaining the heights of Mont Saint-Jean, the vital ground. It was a great tragedy, and the reason why it's really important that the KDG's achievement and their losses are remembered, that more men from the KDGs died at the Battle of Waterloo than the whole of the Light Brigade at Balaclava. Balaclava's passed into folklore, and it's just a shame that more people aren't aware of the sacrifice. 129 men were killed. That was 22% of the regiment. Only 110 were killed at the charge of the Light Brigade. Casualties were 134, so 45%. And it was, as I said, there were only 13 to 15 men standing at the end of the battle. This was sent to me by the Brookborough, Lord Brookborough, who is related to Francis Brooke. Obviously, he's not a descendant because Francis didn't have any children, and it's at Colebrook, County Fermanagh. Many of the KDGs who are based up in Northern Ireland probably have been there, and it commemorates Francis Brooke, who died in that first charge. It shows the solitary horse without the rider. So it was a very bloody affair. And really, I think that this is something that really needs to be remembered. So the next time you see this representation of cavalry at Waterloo, try and blot it out and try and superimpose this on top. Many thanks for being patient with me. I hope you can see the slides all right. I know a lot of you bought this book, but those who haven't, please, proceeds going towards this KDG monument. And we will obviously be doing a collection. We might do a battlefield tour or something, or some sort of fundraising event to try and get this monument put up. But many thanks, and I'll hand over to Hannah now.